The snow had been falling for 3 hours, and the only car in the Blue Pines lot belonged to the girl behind the counter. It was 1:14 in the morning, on a dead Tuesday off Route 9, 20 miles north of Shroon Lake, and Della Hart was wiping down the same stretch of Formica she'd already wiped twice, because the radio was the only company she had, and the songs were better than the silence. She didn't hear the old man come in. She turned around, and he was just there, standing in the doorway with snow melting off the shoulders of a wool coat that probably cost more than her car, breathing like every breath was a debt he was paying off in installments. He looked at her like she was the last lit window in the world. "You're open," he said. Not a question. A relief. What she didn't know, what nobody at the Blue Pine could have guessed, was that the man lowering himself into the corner booth, the one who ordered black coffee and couldn't get his hands to stop shaking, was the father of the most feared man on the eastern seaboard. And in about 90 seconds, this 22-year-old waitress, with a little brother asleep at her aunt's place, and $4 in tips in her apron, was going to do something that pulled her straight down into a world that swallows people whole. Stay with me, because what happened in that diner, and what the old man whispered before the paramedics came, is the kind of thing that changes the rest of a person's life. Before we get into it, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about Della Hart, and the night the storm brought the wolves to her door. Della had taken the overnight shift on purpose. The pay was the same, but nobody bothered you, and the manager, a tired man named Gus, only came in at 6. She'd been working doubles since spring, ever since the county sent the letter saying their mother's hospital bills had gone to collections. Her brother Cody was 9, asthmatic, and the only person on earth who thought Della had everything figured out. She let him keep thinking it. Some lies are a kindness. She kept a photo of the two of them taped to the inside of her locker, and on the bad nights she'd look at it and remind herself why her feet hurt. So when the old man sat down and his coffee cup rattled against the saucer, like it was trying to send Morse code, she noticed. People who wait tables learn to read a room the way a doctor reads an X-ray. She brought him a glass of water he didn't ask for and crouched a little so she wasn't looming over him. "You all right, sir? You look pale." "I'm fine." He smiled, and it was a real smile, warm under the exhaustion the kind fathers give. "I just need a minute. Long drive." "Where you headed in this?" He started to answer. He didn't finish. His eyes did something Della had only seen once before, the night her mother's blood pressure crashed in the ICU. They went distant, like he'd suddenly heard his name called from a great distance, and was trying to figure out who was calling. The water glass slipped. His shoulder hit the table edge on the way down, and then Aldo Vitale was on the floor of a diner he'd never been to, in front of a girl he'd never met, his lips going the color of a winter sky. Della didn't think. That's the thing about her she'd never have told you about herself. She didn't freeze, she moved. She was around that counter before the glass finished rolling. She got 2 fingers to his throat, felt a pulse fluttering fast and thin like a moth against a screen. She put her ear to his mouth and heard him breathing, shallow but breathing. She'd taken a CPR class for the diner 2 summers back and remembered maybe half of it, but she remembered enough to know what not to do. She didn't shake him. She didn't pour water on him. She grabbed the cordless off the wall, dialed 911, put it on speaker, and laid it on the floor by his head while she loosened his collar. And that was when she saw it. Around his neck, on a chain worn soft and gray with decades, hung a little silver medal, St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. Her grandmother had worn one just like it. Della tucked it aside so it wasn't pressing on his windpipe, and the old man's eyes opened. They weren't confused. That was the part that stayed with her later, lying awake. People coming back from a faint are usually muddy, lost. His eyes were sharp, frightened but sharp. His hand came up and closed around her wrist with a strength that didn't match the rest of him, and he pulled her down close, and what he said was not what a sick old man says. "Listen to me. Listen." His voice was a dry whisper, fast, urgent. "There are men coming. Black truck. If they come in here, you never saw me. You understand? You never saw me. Sir, you're having a medical." "Della." He read it off the name tag pinned to her chest, and the sound of her own name in his mouth shut her up. I need you to do one thing, and then you forget my face. His fingers found the St. Christopher medal, and he worked the chain over his own head with hands that barely obeyed him, and he pressed it into her palm and folded her fingers over it. Give this to my son, Marco. You find Marco Vitali and you give him this, and you tell him the watch is where his mother sleeps. Say it back to me. I don't know your son. Say it back. The watch is where his mother sleeps. Her voice shook. The metal was warm from his skin. But who? The bell over the door rang. 2 men came in out of the snow. They were big, and they were dressed wrong for the weather, the way men dress when they expect to be indoors soon. Dark jackets, no hats. Snow on shoulders that didn't seem to bother them. And here is the thing Della understood in a single cold second. The kind of understanding that goes straight past your brain and lands in your stomach. These were not customers. The way they moved when they came in, the way one peeled left and one peeled right, and both of their eyes swept the room before they swept her. She'd seen sheepdogs work a flock with less coordination. The old man's hand had gone slack. He'd closed his eyes. He was, to anyone walking in, a stranger who'd had a spell. And Della Hart, who had never in her life broken a rule bigger than a parking meter, slipped the medal into her apron pocket, stood up, put her body between the 2 men and the old man on the floor, and lied. Can I help you? She said. I already called an ambulance. He just fainted. I think it's his blood sugar or something. Are you family? The bigger of the 2 looked down at Aldo. Something passed over his face, not concern. Calculation, he said. We're family. We'll take it from here, sweetheart. You can go. I really can't leave him. The dispatcher told me to stay with him until I said we'll take it from here. And in the distance, faint under the wind, a siren. The man heard it the same moment she did. His jaw tightened. He looked at the old man, looked at the road, did some arithmetic that Della couldn't follow but could feel, and then he smiled at her, a smile with nothing behind it, and said, on second thought, you're right. He should see a doctor. We'll follow the ambulance. And the 2 of them backed out the door, got into a black pickup with its lights off, and pulled out onto Route 9. Not toward the hospital, but the other way, north, into the dark. The medic who loaded Aldo Vitali into the ambulance asked Della if she knew the patient's name. She heard herself say no. She watched the taillights pull out, and she stood in the empty diner with snow blowing in under the door, and she took the St. Christopher medal out of her apron and held it up to the light, and she thought, with the strange flat clarity that comes after something too big to feel all at once, my God, what did I just step into? She found out who Marco Vitali was the way most people would. She typed his name into her phone at 4 a.m. With the diner locked and the coffee gone cold, and she stopped breathing for a second. The articles called him a lot of things. Businessman. Alleged. Of interest to a federal task force that had been of interest right back at him for 9 years without ever landing a charge. There was a photograph from a courthouse, Marco Vitali in a charcoal suit, 44 years old, the kind of face that doesn't perform anything for the camera, and behind him an old man with silver hair and a familiar wool coat. The caption named the old man as the father, Aldo Vitali, retired. The founder, one article said carefully, of certain family interests in the Northeast. Della set the phone down on the counter face down, like that would help. Here is what Della Hart did not know, and what we know, because we've been watching from above the whole time. 2 days before he walked into the Blue Pine, Aldo Vitali had figured out that he was going to be murdered, not by a rival, by his own house. He had stepped back from the family 7 years earlier and handed it to his son Marco, and for 7 years it had run clean enough, as clean as that kind of thing runs. But a man named Carmine Dello, Marco's cousin and his underboss, the man Marco trusted to stand at his right hand, had grown tired of standing. Carmine had been quietly moving money that wasn't his, and quietly making promises to people who shouldn't have been promised anything, and the only living person who'd noticed, the only person with the standing and the old loyalties to expose him, was the old man nobody paid attention to anymore. So Carmine had arranged for Aldo to be moved. For his protection, he'd told Marco there'd been a threat, an out-of-town crew. The old man should go somewhere safe until it blew over. Marco, who would have laid down his life for his father, and was therefore the easiest man in the world to lie to about his father's safety, had agreed, and the two men who put Aldo in a car had been told to drive him north, to a house on a frozen lake, and to make sure that somewhere along the way the old man's bad heart finally gave out. They'd been feeding him something in his coffee for 2 days to help it along. Aldo had figured that out too, somewhere around the second cup, and at a gas station outside Warrensburg, he'd done the only thing a 71-year-old man, with a failing body and a lifetime of cunning could do. He'd asked to use the restroom, and instead of coming out, he'd walked out the back, across a field of snow in dress shoes, and kept walking until he saw a lit sign that said "Open. The watch is where his mother sleeps." Aldo had spent his last clear-headed minutes not begging a stranger for help, but passing a message, because he understood that he might not get another chance. Inside an old pocket watch, a watch Marco had given him for a birthday a decade ago, a watch hidden now in the one place no soldier would ever think to search, was a recording. Carmine, in his own voice, laying out the whole thing to a man he thought was an ally, enough to end him, enough to save Marco's life, because the day Carmine moved on the old man would be the day before he moved on the son. Della knew none of this. All she knew was that a dying man had trusted her with a saint's medal and a riddle, and that two men with empty smiles had driven off into the dark. And all she knew the next morning was that she had to find a way to keep a promise to a stranger without getting herself and her little brother killed. She didn't have to find Marco Vitale. He found her. It was the following night, near the end of her shift, when the black SUV pulled into the lot. Not a pickup this time. A clean, heavy, expensive thing, and it parked square in the middle of the empty lot, the way only a vehicle owned by someone unafraid parks. Della's hand went to the medal in her apron. She'd carried it on her every minute since, the way you carry a thing you're afraid to lose and afraid to hold. Marco Vitale walked in alone. He was taller than the courthouse photo made him look, and quieter. He didn't fill a room the way the men in movies do, all menace and broad shoulders. He emptied it. The radio seemed stupid suddenly. Della turned it off without deciding to. He sat at the counter, not the booth, and he folded his hands and his eyes, and she'd remember this. His eyes were red-rimmed in a way that no amount of stillness could hide. This was a man who had not slept and had been crying somewhere private where no one was allowed to see. "My father's in a hospital in Glens Falls," he said, without introduction, his voice low and even. "He woke up an hour ago. The doctors say a young woman at a diner off Route 9 kept her head and called for help, and that if she hadn't, he'd be dead." He looked up at her. He won't say much, he's not himself. But he said one thing clearly. He said, "The girl has it. Give Marco what the girl has." He let that sit. I think you know what he meant. For a long moment, Della didn't move. She thought about Cody. She thought about the federal articles and the empty smile men and the word alleged. She thought about how the only smart thing, the only safe thing, was to say, "I don't know what you're talking about," and let this man walk back out into the snow and out of her life. Instead, she took the medal out of her apron and set it on the counter between them, and she watched a man who probably hadn't shown anyone a true thing in 20 years come apart very quietly over a worn piece of silver his father had worn every day of his life. "He gave you this," Marco said. It wasn't a question, but his voice cracked down the middle of it. "He made me promise to bring it to you, and to tell you something." She took a breath. He said, "The watch is where his mother sleeps." Marco went still in a way that was different from his other stillness. This was the stillness of a man hearing a door open in a house he thought was empty. "Where his mother sleeps," he repeated. "My mother, Rosa." His eyes moved over Della's face, reading her the way the old man had. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand what you stepped in front of last night?" "No," Della said honestly. "But I understood that he was scared, and that they weren't really his family. And I've got a brother. I know what it looks like when somebody loves somebody." Something in Marco's face shifted at that. He looked at her like she was a math problem that had just resolved into something simpler and stranger than he expected. "What's your name?" "Della Hart, Della Hart." He said it the way his father had, like he was filing it somewhere permanent. "You're not safe. You understand that at least. The men who came in here, they'll have made you. They'll know a waitress saw too much, talked to him too long. People like that don't leave loose ends because it's untidy. He stood. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take me to whatever my father told you, and I'm going to make sure that you and your brother are somewhere those men can't reach, and then I'm going to deal with the men. He said the last part the way you might say, take out the trash. And for the first time Della felt the cold weight of who, exactly, was standing in her diner. I don't know where the watch is, she said. I only know the words. I do, Marco said softly. I know exactly where my mother sleeps. Rosa Vitale was buried in a small Catholic cemetery on a hill above the town where Marco had grown up, a 2-hour drive south, and they reached it as the sun was coming up gray over the headstones. Marco drove himself. He'd sent his men away. All of them, every soldier, because that was the thing he'd worked out in the diner parking lot at 3 in the morning while Della watched from the window. If his father had hidden evidence rather than coming straight to his son, it could only mean one thing. His father didn't know who Marco's loyal men were anymore, which meant Marco didn't either. The threat wasn't outside the house, it was inside it. And a man who can't trust his own soldiers has exactly one person he can bring to dig up his mother's grave, and to his own quiet astonishment, it was a 22-year-old waitress he'd met the day before. The watch wasn't in the grave, of course. Aldo wasn't a cruel man. It was tucked into the hollow base of the stone flower urn that sat at the foot of Rosa's headstone, wrapped in oilcloth, exactly where a grieving husband might kneel 100 times without anyone thinking twice. Marco lifted it out with hands that were not steady, and he opened the case, and inside, behind the watch face, was a small audio recorder no bigger than a stick of gum. He played it standing there in the cold with the frost burning his knees through his trousers. Della heard it too, a voice, Carmine's, though she didn't know it, talking easily, almost bored, about how the old man was a problem that solved itself, how Marco would be grieving and distracted and easy, how the family's upstate had already agreed to look the other way when the seat changed hands. The casual cruelty of it, the way the man talked about killing the people he ate dinner with. Marco didn't rage. Della had braced for rage. What she got was worse, a silence so complete and so cold that the birds seemed to stop. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle. Carmine held my son at his christening, he said, to no one, to the headstone, to his dead mother. He stood next to me at my wife's funeral. He closed the watch. He looked at Della, and the thing in his eyes had changed again, had hardened into something with a temperature far below freezing. You gave me my father's life and my own in the same week, Della Hart. I don't know yet what kind of man that makes me owe you, but I pay what I owe. And here's the part the comments always argue about, so let me lay it out straight and tell me below what you'd have done in her place. Because Della Hart had a choice right there on that hill. She could have taken Marco Vitale's protection and his gratitude and let him handle it his way, the way men like him have always handled things, in the dark, with the law nowhere in sight. That recording in Marco's hands ended Carmine. Permanently, no trial, no witnesses. But Della had a little brother who believed she had everything figured out. And she had a mother who'd died owing money to a system that had never once bent the rules for them, and she found that she could not stand on the grave of a woman she'd never met and help one more thing disappear into that dark. There's another way, she said. If you do it your way, you become him, the man on that tape, and someday your son finds out what his father is. She nodded at the watch. That recording's enough to send a man to prison for the rest of his life. You don't have to be the one who buries him. Let the law do the one useful thing it's ever going to do. Marco Vitale looked at her for a long, long time. No one had told him no in 15 years. No one had dared to tell him what kind of man to be since his father had stopped being able to. And a waitress had just done both, on a frozen hilltop, with her chin up and her hands shaking. What happened over the next 3 days? The papers would spend 3 months trying to reconstruct, and they'd never get it quite right, because the truth was stranger than what they printed. A federal task force agent named Patricia Okafor, who had been chasing the Vitale family for 9 years and had nothing to show for it but a wall of surveillance photos and a divorce, received an anonymous package containing a single audio recording and an address. She would say, later, in the careful language of someone who'd been told never to speculate, that the recording arrived from an unexpected direction. What she meant was that the most untouchable man she'd ever investigated had handed her the rope to hang his own cousin, and had asked for nothing in return except that a young woman and a 9-year-old boy be left entirely, permanently, out of it. Carmine Dello was arrested at a restaurant he owned, in front of the men he'd promised the kingdom to, none of whom lifted a finger, because that recording had played for them too, and there is no loyalty like the loyalty of frightened men to whoever holds the proof. He'd be convicted on his own voice. Conspiracy, racketeering, attempted murder. Life, the judge said, and the old men in the back of the courtroom nodded like the word tasted right. Aldo Vitale came home from the hospital to a house that was finally truly quiet. He sat in the sun on the back porch with a blanket over his knees, and when his son told him what the waitress had said on the hill, about the law, about the kind of man Marco's son would someday find out his father was, the old man laughed until he coughed and wiped his eyes and said, "Marco, Marco, we spent 40 years building something out of fear, and a girl who pours coffee for a living looked at it for one day and told us we'd done it all wrong." He took his son's hand. "Don't you dare let her get away without thanking her properly." But the thing about Della Hart is that she never asked for thanks, and the things she got instead came quietly, the way the only real kindnesses ever do. The collections agency that had been hounding her about her mother's bills called one Tuesday to say the debt had been resolved by a third party and would say nothing more. Cody's specialist, the one in Albany they could never afford, suddenly had an opening and a waived fee. A scholarship fund Della had never applied to wrote to inform her she'd been selected. She knew. Of course she knew. And once, only once, she drove to the cemetery on the hill, because something told her she'd find him there, and she did. A man in a charcoal coat standing at a grave, and she stood beside him for a while without either of them saying much. Two people who'd met because a storm and a saint's medal and a single brave choice had stitched their lives together for one impossible week. "I keep waiting to feel like I did something wrong," she told him, lying for him, digging up your mother's grave, all of it. "You didn't do anything wrong," Marco said. "You did the only thing in the whole business that was right." He turned the St. Christopher medal over in his fingers. His father had insisted Della keep it, and she wore it now, the patron saint of travelers, of people far from home, trying to find their way back. "My father carried that for 50 years, and it never once kept him out of trouble. First time it ever did its job was the night he gave it away." 3 years later, Della Hart finished her nursing degree, the first person in her family to finish anything past high school, and Cody, 14 now and a head taller than her, sat in the second row and cried in a way he'd deny forever. And somewhere off Route 9, the blue pine still glows its tired light into the dark for whoever the storm brings in. And the girl who used to work the overnight there learned the thing it takes most people a whole life to learn, and some people never learn at all, that the world is full of frightened men who'll tell you the dangerous thing is the smart thing, the only thing, the way it has to be. And every so often somebody pours their coffee, looks them in the eye, and shows them they were wrong. So let me leave you with this, and I really do want your answer down in the comments. If a stranger collapsed in front of you and pressed something into your hand and begged you to keep a secret you didn't understand, would you have done what Della did? Or would you have walked away and kept yourself safe? There's no wrong answer, but I have a feeling the way you answer says everything about you. Let me know below where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if this story moved you, and I'll see you in the next one.